Hey everybody, it's Mark here with New England Debate, and today we're going to talk about vagueness arguments, or what might be called specification arguments. Now, I hear these all the time when I am judging, and the problem is no one's running them very well. Here's what I usually hear. The worst situation is when I hear someone simply say, the plan isn't vague, therefore vote for the negative team. And that basically is the extent of that argument. The problem is, ironically, that argument is really vague. The maybe more common, but still I would argue inadequate way of making this point is they'll say something like, the plan isn't vague on this particular aspect. So it might be funding, it might be the specific part of the executive branch that's going to be implementing the plan, something like that, some detail of the plan. They'll say, this is vague, this isn't explained, and therefore we don't really know if the plan is going to function. Please vote negative. I still think that doesn't actually make a very strong argument. And to explain how, let's step back and look at this much more broadly. This type of argument, this vagueness or specification argument, in most iterations is a theory argument. So in other words, it is an argument about what should or should not be allowed by the judge in their method of enforcing that, which is voting, as a type of thing. So for example, a topicality is a theory argument because you're arguing that affirmative teams shouldn't be allowed to present a non-topical case. In other words, the judge should vote against them, and then that discourages the practice of running non-topical plans. The vagueness thing functions in a similar way. It's saying the affirmative team shouldn't be allowed to be vague about their plan in this way, or some teams would just say be allowed to be vague at all. So now that we're looking at it from this theory perspective, we have to understand that it's not that easy. You can't just say, well, the plan has to be 100% clear, because most plans, if they were 100% clear, would be the size of bills that are passed in Congress, because that's essentially what a plan is. It's a proposed bill. Most bills are huge. There's no way you could read them even in 8 minutes. So the plan necessarily has to be vague in some ways. In other words, it can't have the full clarity of what a law actually looks like. And lacking that full clarity means it is vague in certain ways. So then the question becomes, how do we determine what levels of vagueness are acceptable and what types of vagueness are not acceptable? And that's the really interesting, tricky question. So here's how I would run a vagueness or specification argument. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best way or the only way, but it does do two things. One, it provides a very clear warrant and bright line for what the affirmative team needs to specify and clarify, and it provides an impact. Because what all the vagueness arguments I hear are lacking are impacts. They say, well, we don't know exactly how the plan is going to work. Okay, but in what way do you not know this? Right? Can't we make some assumptions? We have to make assumptions in debate rounds, or else, again, the plan would have to be the size of actual bills. And then there's not much after that, right? You've just kind of made a broad statement about we don't know. Okay, but in what ways do you not know, and in what ways are those important? You've become vague yourself. So here's how I would do it. First of all, you need to ask the affirmative team to clarify and specify. If, for instance, you think that their plan costs a lot of money and they haven't provided a way to fund it, you should ask them, okay, you didn't say anything about funding, so you're just going to fund this through the normal way that Congress funds bills, correct? Yes. And then maybe you have an inflation disadvantage prepared. You say, okay, so the normal way that Congress funds bills is essentially by printing more currency, correct? And hopefully they say yes. If not, maybe you can get them to do that, because that's basically what happens. I mean, there's really no relationship, for instance, between taxation and federal government spending anymore. So try to get them to clarify in the cross-ex, because it's extremely disingenuous if you don't do any of that and then you come up in the next speech and argue that they haven't been clear. Well, there was an entire 3-minute opportunity for you to ask these kinds of questions and get them to clarify, and you didn't take it. So as a judge, I'm going to look at that very skeptically. And if I'm the affirmative team, I'm going to be trying to turn their argument and argue that, in fact, the person being abusive, in debate terms, abusive, is in fact the negative team, because they're arguing we haven't clarified when they never even gave us a chance to clarify. When instead we could be talking about arguments that actually matter. So you've got to give the affirmative team a solid 100% committed effort to actually clarify or specify the thing that you are trying to argue is too vague. And also, from a kind of like sportsmanship or debating nobly perspective, it's not very noble to like spring the vagueness argument on them without asking about it in cross-ex. That's just bad form. Once you've done that, let's suppose the affirmative team still is hedging. They do not want to give you a straight answer. You really press them on it and you say, this is really important. We need to know the answer to this question. Then I think the general perception from debaters and participants and judges and everyone watching is that you can kind of assume that it's going to be the most normal method, right? So for instance, you can't say, well, they didn't specify funding, therefore we're going to assume that we're going to invade Canada and steal all their money. No, that's a terrible assumption, right? You assume the most common, basic, normal way of doing things. And that kind of smooths over this complexity problem where we only have 8 minutes to give a speech. So you've got those under control. You've asked them. They're still dodgy. They're not willing to commit to one way or another. But you really want to run this inflation argument because their plan costs a lot of money, and you're going to argue that it's going to cause significant inflation. Here's what you do in the speech. You set up a double bind. You say, Judge, we have this inflation disadvantage. We're going to run it, but the affirmative team is not committed that their plan is actually going to essentially print money to pay for it. Now, we think, absent any specification, we can assume the plan's going to be paid for in the regular way, which is printing money. However, the affirmative team is unwilling to commit to this. So first, I'm going to run an argument. I'm going to run this disadvantage. We're going to assume, I think this is the most straightforward assumption, that their plan is financed this way. Here's the inflation disadvantage. You run the inflation disadvantage. After you do that, you say, now the affirmative team could come up and say, no, we're not doing the inflation thing. We're not printing more money to finance this. We're doing something else. In other words, after the argument's run, they then specify on something else or clarify on something else. Judge, you should not allow them to do that. And if they do that, they're committing what's called a ground shift. In other words, they presented their plan as one idea, and then after hearing an argument, they changed their plan. Do not allow them to do that. In fact, you should vote against them for doing that. If affirmative teams were allowed to do that in every round, they could just shift out of every argument and you'd never have a debate. Affirmative teams would win all the time if that was deemed acceptable. And all the good parts of debate, which is actually interacting with arguments and hitting things head on, would disappear because it's literally the opposite of that. So if they do that, please vote against them on theoretical grounds, on theory grounds. Again, this is often called abuse. A lot of judges, I think, especially in the NCFCA and STOA, don't think that's a weird term for it. It kind of makes sense if you're not familiar and not using this language a lot. It seems extreme. So you can phrase it in different ways. But then you set up the double bind. Either they go with your common sense, here, this is what we think the plan will actually do, we'll link into this disadvantage, then we can debate the disadvantage, or they ground shift, and then, Judge, you should vote against them because they have ground shifted. What this does is, first of all, it provides a very clear reason why you need to have this clarification or this specification. And the reason is an argument hinges on it. We have an argument that is prepared, that is ready to go, that is dependent on the answer to these questions. It's not just the plan is vague, therefore that's bad, don't vote for it. It's bad because they need to specify so we know whether or not this argument applies. So first of all, this method justifies why this thing needs to be clarified. And two, it provides an impact. The impact is either everything's cool, they agree with us in the end, the disadvantage happens, we can have a real debate, or if they try to get out of it and they remain vague or non-committal, then you have an impact of, look, they're not letting us run this argument that is a legitimate argument that may or may not apply to the plan because they haven't been willing to specify whether or not it does apply to the plan. This is called, in theory terms, in-round abuse, to distinguish it from this kind of hypothetical abuse. So it's a stronger argument because the judge can see, look, there is valid debate that by being vague and not committing to some aspect of the plan, the affirmative team is dodging, and therefore it's much easier to see why saying this needs to be specified is actually important. So that's how I would run these arguments. Obviously, prepare them. As with any argument you think of, if it's prepared ahead of time, the better. But I challenge every one of you to not run these very non-committal, ironically vagueness arguments anymore. Run them in a more precise, impactful way. And I think you'll see that the quality of debate goes up and you'll probably have more success with them. Thanks for watching. There's lots of opportunities for coaching. You can hire me as a private coach. I've got workshops going on. I got classes that are going to be coming up for next semester. Please go to newenglanddebate.com to see what is available. And if you click subscribe in the top right corner and enter your email address, you'll automatically be sent an email with more debate tips like this and with all of the coaching workshop opportunities we have going forward. So go ahead and do that, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel because I'll be doing more videos as well. Thanks for watching. Bye.